Hi everyone, welcome back to the Pews. Today we're going to talk about Paul. Who was Paul? We read his epistles all the time in church when we sit in our pews, but who was Paul? And here's even a better question. Who was Paul before he was Paul? That's an interesting story, and we're going to talk about that as it comes from the book of Acts. Let's come along. I think if we wanted to start with Paul, let's start with who was Paul before Paul was Paul. Paul, when we're first introduced to him in Acts, he's a man named Saul of Tarsus. Um, Interesting place. Tarsus is up the Mediterranean and around the bend. Actually, for you, it would be that way. And heading towards Rome. Paul was actually a Roman citizen, but he was a Pharisee. Paul had a very extensive education. He would be what the Pharisees called learned. He learned at the feet of a famous rabbi called Gamaliel. And Gamaliel's name appears a couple of times in the book of Acts. But Gamaliel was a renowned rabbi teacher, and he grew up at his feet. So when they sat on the steps, he was sitting below him, listening to him. Paul was a master of the Torah, and what the Jews called the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, which would be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5. And he was a master of it. Those are the laws God created and gave to the Jews. So he knew them inside and out. So Shaul, I'll start calling him Shaul of Tarsus. Shaul was a master of the law, and Shaul was a feared man. So when Shaul would go out and attack Christians, he would imprison them, he would beat them. And Stephen, if we remember Stephen, he was one of the gang that went around preaching the word of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus. Shaul, as by his own definition, he held the coats of the men that killed him, that martyred him. So Shaul was complicit in Stephen's death. But Shaul was a feared man. He was feared by everybody, all Christians. People scattered. He helped spread Christianity because people scattered just to get away from him, and they would spread out and teach Christianity. So even before he was Jesus's apostle, he was still spreading Christianity, believe it or not. But Paul was feared by the apostles, Peter and those guys. They feared Paul. That was one of the things. They would hide. After Jesus died, they hide in the room. Remember, in the upper chamber with the doors locked, they were afraid. So, all right, let's talk about Shaul, his transformation into Paul. How did this happen? Well, he was on the road to Damascus, hunting down Christians, and then he was blinded by a light. He couldn't see. Him and his companions were standing there, and they were blinded. And Shaul heard a voice, and the voice said, "Shaul, Shaul, why do you persecute me?" And then Shaul answered and said, "Who art thou, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, the one you persecuteth." So he said, "Why do you kick against the pricks?" So at that point, he had frozen Paul and blinded him. And he told him to go on to Damascus and wait there 3 days, and somebody will come. And 3 days later, Ananias came and saw Shaul, and the scales fell off his eyes, and he could see again. But he went 3 days without eating or drinking or seeing, and now he can see again. But Jesus had given him a revelation. So now, after this, Shaul went out. He's now transformed into Paul. He's now called Paul. Like every big name in the Bible, all gets a new name. Everybody gets a new name. Even Steely Dan wants to be Deacon Blues. But everybody gets a new name in the Bible. And Shaul's new name is Paul. So Paul now goes out. He spends some time, about 14 years, and then he comes back and he meets up with Barnabas. And Barnabas was one of the ones out preaching the gospel, and Barnabas wanted to bring him to meet Peter and the apostles, but they were afraid of him because they know of his reputation. They didn't want to meet with him. But Barnabas forced the issue and they came in to meet. But Paul's job was to go out to the Gentiles. That's what Jesus wanted him to do, to go out and preach to the Gentiles. Part of what Jesus told him, he said he's going to go out and he's going to suffer when he's out. And Paul did suffer. Paul was beaten 5 times. He was given 40 stripes save one, which is 39, 5 times. He was beaten with a rod 3 times, and he was stoned and presumed dead once. He was shipwrecked a couple of times, and even bitten by a viper, and a poisonous viper that thought that would kill him. But Paul was a gutsy guy. Paul, when he was out with Barnabas, they were really pushing it. Like Paul would go into the synagogues, because you remember Paul was a master of the Torah. So he would pound the Torah and then he would pound the prophets, and it would anger these Jews that were in the synagogues, and they flipped. Like places like Thessalonica, Paul only taught there 3 Sabbaths, and he created a riot. They chased him out of town. So Paul and Barnabas would go out and preach, and Paul was tough. He blasted them, he hit them in the face with all his knowledge and the revelation that Jesus had given to him, and it angered the Jews. And it got to a point where Paul said, "Okay, let's go back and visit the churches that we created in the various cities." He's telling Barnabas this, and Barnabas said, "Okay, let's bring Mark." And Paul said no, because when they were in Pamphylia, Mark left them because he sort of ran, because Paul was out there. He was pounding, creating riots, and Mark couldn't take it. So he had a fight with Barnabas, and Paul finally said, "Look, you want Mark, you take Mark, you go your way. I'll take Silas and I'll go my way." And they separated. Okay, so let's read some proof about Paul's knowledge and how it came from a revelation. It comes from his letter to Ephesus. Now, Ephesus was kind of a crazy place, but he wrote a letter to the church of Ephesus. These people in Ephesus believed in this god called Diana. They had this huge, like a temple, huge building. It was one of the wonders of the world. And Diana was another fake god that they worshipped, but he had a church there. So I don't want to get off on the side on Ephesus. So let's read Ephesians 3:2 and 3. "If ye have heard of the dispensation of grace of God, which is given me to you word, how that by revelation he made known unto me the mystery." When he's talking about this, he's talking about the mystery. The mystery is the end time. That's the mystery. Paul would go on to write 14 of the 27 books in the New Testament. Paul, his revelation was given to the churches. He gave them to them in pieces. Some of the epistles is a fancy name for a letter. Some of the epistles that he wrote to the different churches are very fascinating, like the 2 letters to the Corinthians. Obviously, he's answering a letter that they sent to him, because his answer is really kind of, in some cases, when you read it, it is really off the wall. But inside of his epistles are a lot of valuable information that every Christian relishes, because he talks about various things. Now, I want to get to the end time, and I want to read a quote from Revelation, because I think this relates to Paul. And the book is called Revelation. It is not Revelations. It is one revelation. And it drives me nuts when Christians say revelations. It's not. The Bible is a book of revelations. We as Christians, sometimes I don't understand how what we see in church with the pageantry and things like that, how we get from Paul and the apostles to what we see in church each week. Sometimes, I kind of chuckle when I sit there in my pew.
I get to clothe the leper. Lucky.
But back to let's read Revelation 21. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Okay, at this point in Revelation, they're describing New Jerusalem, which is going to come down from heaven, which when we are resurrected, if we are resurrected at the first, resurrection, we will go to the New Jerusalem. And he's telling us how the 12 foundation stones are going to be the apostles of the Lamb. Now that's Jesus. The Lamb is Jesus. So who are these 12 foundations? How does this work? We know 11 of them. Is Judas's name on a foundation stone? I don't think so, because Jesus said in the Gospels, it's better that the man that betrays me was never born. I doubt it was him. Was it the 12th apostle, which was Matthias? Because after Judas's death, they felt they needed a 12th to fill it out, and they couldn't decide on who. They prayed to God for an answer and prayed to Jesus for an answer, but they got no answer. So they cast lots and came out with this guy, Matthias. Now, I don't think Matthias is going to be the 12th one for a couple of reasons. He wasn't chosen by Jesus like the other 11 were. And the rest of the books, we don't read anything about Matthias. We don't know anything about him. So I think the 12th apostle is going to be Paul. And because Paul, was chosen by Jesus, he stopped him in his tracks and called him into service. So I think it's going to be Paul. But like everything in the Bible, there's a bit of ambiguous to it. And I guess I'll have to be a good boy and go to New Jerusalem and head to the foundation stones to find out who is the 12th. And I think we're going to leave it right there. Thanks for sitting with me in the pews. I'll catch you next week.